Hey everybody, this is Stephanie Francisco. I'm Communications Director with Conservation Alabama, and we're back for another Conservation Q&A video chat. And today we're going to talk about elections with Justin Kwasa, who's the Voting Rights Program Director with League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. And Justin is joining us from DC. So thanks so much, Justin.
No, anytime. Glad to be here. Glad to be here.
So I'm going to ask you the question that we at Conservation Alabama get a fair amount, which is why does an environmental organization care about voting?
No, it's a great question. That's basically my full job is to answer that question. So I do, well, basically the reason why, environmental organizations do and should care about elections is the fact that we require our democracy, we require our state legislatures, we require Congress in order to pass laws. And in order to make sure that we have the best chance in order to pass comprehensive environmental laws that actually make a difference, we need to make sure that we have the ability to elect the elected officials that are going to pass those laws. We need to be able, it's kind of like the game behind the game, where it's like, yes, it's important to be able to, advocate for environmental laws, positively, but also it would be really nice if you had state legislatures and our Congress set up in a way where they will be open to listening and to applying the science behind environmental laws, environmental legislation in order to make sure that we're actually protecting our land and our water and our earth. So that's why we dive head forward into the democracy space and make sure that everybody has the ability to vote as well as advocate.
So obviously nobody's job is really normal right now, but I guess like pre-pandemic, what was your, is there like a typical day for the voting rights program? What was your main focus before we changed gears a couple months ago?
Yeah, so the typical day, it does involve working with organizations such as your own, making sure that in each of the individual states, environmental organizations are making elections a priority and making sure that giving people the ability to have their voice heard through voting, make sure that's a priority and figuring out with whatever capacity they can how to join that fight. So honestly, in a very weird way, my work hasn't changed that much. I guess it's a little bit more demanding since, elections have become so much more of a hot priority. But honestly, the job that you're doing, as well as, some of the things that we advocate for, that hasn't changed. It's just that the urgency behind it has changed a lot. And so we've been busy the past 2 months.
Yeah, you're in like a growth industry right now as everyone tries to figure out what the heck we're supposed to do.
Right.
Well, and then here in Alabama, we rescheduled our primary runoff. It was supposed to be March 31st. Now it's been bumped to July 14th. What advice do you have? I know we watched Wisconsin vote a couple weeks ago, and it was sort of terrifying to see those photos of like long lines of people trying to stay at some sort of socially distanced way apart, but that seems very difficult. What advice do you have for us as we start to think about voting in July? How do we avoid, being like Wisconsin, where they have a whole crop of new virus cases after voting, and still make sure everybody can cast their ballot in this really important election?
Right. Well, I think one of the first things that's very positive is that you all delayed the election. So you brought yourself time. And I think, number one, I think that's the biggest thing, because Wisconsin, it got down to the 0 hour, and 24 hours before votes were supposed to be cast, it was in doubt whether they were going to have the election, which is never going to lead to anything great. But ultimately, I think it's really reevaluating what absentee voting means in the state. What we saw was, Wisconsin had absentee ballot available, but with the increased demand absentee ballots that were requested, a lot of times we saw that ballots didn't get to where they were supposed to go, and people who did request absentee ballots in plenty enough time because of that demand didn't get them, and then had to force to make those decisions to stand in 4 or 5 hour lines in order to vote. So, number one, I would say is making absentee ballots available to everybody without excuse. And right now, there's the workaround that you all have of, oh, well, because we're in quarantine, it's now considered a medical condition, so you can get that. But ultimately, making no excuse at all for absentee ballots, just people should be able to request them as early as possible whenever they want to, is something that should be instituted. But what we also saw is because absentee ballots didn't get to where they were supposed to go, still making sure that you have plenty of in-person options in order for people to go in person, which also would include having early voting. The more times that people can go to polling places, and it's not just the 10 hours on one particular day, that also helps make safer polling places, because now all of a sudden people have more options to go. You don't have to stand in line necessarily as long. I mean, it is voting day, so there will always be some types of lines.
Right.
And then the final thing I would say is how you accept absentee ballots as well. So right now, Alabama, you need to have sent off your ballot the day before the election. And so, especially with so many moving parts, because this is so new, I think it's really important to give people as much time as possible in order to send their ballots back. And so being able to have a system where counties can accept ballots that were postmarked by the day of and not the day before is really important, because we're all in uncharted territories. And so as many options as we can to give people time to send their votes in, the better.
Well, and so we're talking today, it's April 28th. I had to check my calendar. I have no idea what day it is. It's April 28th. And Ohio is voting today, and they had delayed their primary to today. Is that right?
Yes, they did. Yeah.
Okay. So did they make any other kind of accommodations besides delaying, or is this sort of the normal? Is this a normal election day for them, just a little later than it was supposed to be?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's a normal election day, just a little bit later. So, what they were able to do, as we mentioned before, was able to then be able to process and make the adjustments, particularly for absentee ballots, in order to make sure that they can operate that, as well as implement CDC recommended guidelines for opening up polling places. And so, it's still going to be touch and go. It's still going to be very interesting, and I think we're all looking very closely to Ohio to see what adjustments have been made in order to be able to, further on the lines, continue to make adjustments in further states. But yeah, I just think, once again, I think it was them to be able to buy time and to adjust to a system where a significantly larger amount of people will be voting by mail rather than coming into their polling place.
Yeah. Well, and that's what, we've been recommending to our members really since the election was moved in Alabama. Go ahead and request your absentee ballot, plan on voting absentee in July. But one of the sort of speed bumps for that in Alabama is we have a voter ID requirement. And for an absentee ballot, that means a voter has to have access to a copy machine or like a scanner and a printer to be able to physically make a copy of their ID and mail it off. Do other states have that?
So not many states have it. Alabama's one of the few. I believe West Virginia also has something very similar, where you need to have some type of ID in order to vote, as well as Wisconsin, which was also something that was very hotly contested. Is if you are requiring absentee ballots, you need verification. So you need other people in order to verify that you are who you are. And so for people in isolation, that is as restrictive to a lot of people as a voter ID law. But I think the biggest thing to say is 48 other states are able to request absentee ballots without without an ID, and nobody's saying that there's a huge conspiracy. There's absolutely a way to request absentee ballots in a safe way, and to keep elections, integrity of elections, safe through a lot of back end adjustments that need to be made anyway when you have absentee ballots. You need to be able to track those ballots, and with scanners, with barcodes, with those IDs, you can make sure that people are only voting once. You can make sure that people are who they say they are, and you can make sure, in order to process election in a very quick way, to where we have results the day of the election, and not like Wisconsin, which was also something that wasn't great. Was a week later they told you what the results were, which reasonably people will question kind of what's going on with that whole point. And so the technology needs to implement a vote by mail system will kind of take care of that in terms of we'll be able to track ballots in a way to make sure that everybody votes once and everybody has their voice heard.
And there's at least one bill in Congress now, right, that's talking about a national vote by mail program. Do you see that? I mean, what's the likelihood that that's going to make it through, and that would impact November's election?
Right. So, I mean, you always know the jokes about DC, but this is DC. So
Right.
yes, there are actually a couple bills out there that ask for, you know, a national vote by mail system, or just to make any number of adjustments that come with vote by mail. Because also vote by mail isn't just vote by mail, but also having the in-person options. But you know, we are going to fight for that. We are going to fight for having an additional $3.6 billion of funds for states in order to implement different absentee voting strategies. We're still going to fight for that. But ultimately, when it comes to who has the most influence on election, it still is the states. It still is the Secretary of State. It still is the county clerks. They're the ones that are really administering the elections. And so any true changes need to come from them. And so we're still, while we are going to fight as much as we can for the funding and for overall strategy on the national level, on the federal level, it still is very important in order for people to reach out to their state and local legislatures or election administrators in order to make sure that all of these best practices that we know from and that we've learned from Ohio's and the Wisconsins are actually implemented and you know, lead to fair and proper elections.
And I mean, you're talking about some of the funding that's available at the federal level. They've already had that sort of first round of election grants to states. So this seems like, I mean, it's sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity to take, well, we hope once in a lifetime, to take all of those problems and apply some like big influxes of federal cash to try to solve them. So, you know, especially in a state like Alabama, one of the things we hear a lot is, well, that's just too expensive. We don't have the tax revenue to make that happen. And it's like, okay, here, pretty big pot of money. We can probably figure out how to let people mail in absentee ballots without a physical copy of a driver's license, you know, in 2020. So that's encouraging, I guess.
Right. And from that, you know, that share right now, it's estimated that the state of Alabama will get somewhere around 6.5 million. And from what the Secretary of State sent in, it's mostly going to be sent towards absentee election costs for primary and general, which is great, but also a little bit vague in terms of specifics. But, you know, it still is in the right place, as well as sanitation of polling places during the election. So, you know, in general, I think the state of Alabama is saying the right things, but also the devil's in the details. And so, you know, still doing the accountability work in order to make sure that it's going to the right places and that also it's being used equitably.
Do you think, I mean, from what you've seen in other states so far and what you've seen at the federal level, do you think there are changes that are being made that are going to stick around, you know, past the pandemic? Do you see any sort of big systemic changes happening to the voting conversation right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, we after 2020, I think we're all going to have a large conversation about what does it mean to vote by mail and how do we implement this. You know, for most states, you know, the vote by mail or requests for vote by mail is usually under 10%. And everywhere across the country, we already know it's going to be way above that. And so I think we are fundamentally going to change how we think about voting, because I feel like there will be a lot of people who do this for the first time and realize, oh, wait, instead of going to a polling place and, you know, you have that internal clock in your head of I need to make all these decisions or I need to look at this huge ballot initiative with legalese and like make the decision. Wait, I can actually take this home, sit down and actually look through it and, you know, look up like who these candidates are and figure out, you know, I think that it's a totally different way to think about what voting means. And so I think particularly for vote by mail, I think a lot of these are going to be permanent or, you know, there will be a huge push in 2021 in order to make some of these changes permanent. Hopefully because everything ran smoothly and fine. I mean, you know, hopefully we run better elections because of that. But in general, just because I think people will have a different view of what voting means. And so in particular, I mentioned some of these before, you know, expanding early voting, making sure that you don't need an excuse for absentee voting. And then also, but there's also some registration parts. So ideally, particularly when registering, being able to do automatic voter registration where, hey, try to get anything from the Department of Motor Vehicles or access some type of social service, you can, while you're doing that, register to vote for at the same time. And then ideally, in a great best case scenario, also have same day voter registration, because we now have the technology administering our elections where we can actually track people and make sure that, hey, even if you didn't register to vote, we have all the proper information in order to register you the day of and make sure your voice is heard, even though you didn't register 3 weeks in advance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, changing gears, I mean, this is obviously not just an election year, but we're doing a census in 2020, which is great timing. And from what I take it, the census collection period has been stretched out and sort of delayed, right,
Yes.
to give folks
Yes.
more time to respond. From your perspective and your role, why should we fill out the census? What's important about this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, just want to inform everybody that census is the time frame to fill it out has been extended to Halloween. I would not wait till then. Do it actually like right now. Actually, once you're finished watching this video, please go straight to my census2020.com and fill that out. But ultimately, I think the same reasons that I said that voting is important is the exact same reason that census is important, is because there's actually a couple things, but number one, from a voting perspective, census, part of the census process is the redistricting process in 2021, where, we redraw both, local, state, and federal boundaries in terms of where people are getting, or in terms of what areas that people are supposed to represent. And so from that process, it goes back to saying it's another way in order to help set up our elected officials in a way where they can be most responsive to environmental legislation. So that's number one reason why it's important. But also, there are absolutely direct environmental consequences for the census as well. I mean, census data helps fund numerous programs in the EPA, in the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Department of the Interior, that directly go to energy consumption, that directly go to wildlife restoration, that directly influence how public transportation, how roads and highways are built, and how that affect the environment around us. And so, in addition to, really affecting voting, there are specific programs within our federal government that the census funds to make sure that, clean air and clean water is enforced equally and equitably as well.
That's interesting. I didn't know. So I knew that it was in terms of redistricting and how many representatives you get and that kind of thing, but I didn't realize it was so closely tied to actual programmatic funding.
Yeah.
So that's another great reason. And we'll put, I would not be like a good YouTuber if I didn't say we'll put the link to the census in the description box, and people can just, as soon as they finish watching, click on over. It takes no time at all.
10 minutes that affect the next 10 years of our lives.
It's pretty important. I know Alabama, we've got at least one congressional district on the chopping block, and there's a rumor that we might have two we would lose. So that would not be great for our state.
Absolutely.
Yeah, pretty important stuff. Well, Justin, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all your work to help make people, make sure our voices are heard on Election Day and beyond. We really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. You have a good one.
You too.